All right, welcome to part 2. So if you remember from last time, Napoleon had just attempted to invade Russia. Russia had beaten him back, and the Russians celebrated this as they well should, but it didn't do much to help the Tsar's relations with the boyars. And the Tsars were always interested in gaining more power, expanding Russia further, and the boyars are the main group that stands in the way of the Tsars having total power over Russia. And so they continued taking power from them, doing it in whatever way they could. They would often simply seize land or seize rights from the boyars, but most often the Tsars would buy the power from the boyars by basically giving the boyars total control over their serfs. And so the boyars got more and more control over the peasants that were on their land. In return, they gave the Tsar more of this centralized control over the government. And so while in Western Europe, life was continuing on in a way that would look pretty modern to us. Modern economic things, there were factories, there were businesses. In Russia in particular, in Eastern Europe in general, there was much more of a descent into abject serfdom. Some of them were even could be considered slaves today. The boyars were given power to do pretty much anything they wanted to with the serfs except kill them. They could sell the serfs. There were even serfs that were not necessarily working the land, but they were having to work factories. So this is the way that Russia, by the middle of the 1800s, serfdom was at its highest point. And along comes Tsar Alexander II, and he abolished serfdom. But instead of putting something in place that would replace it, something that would bring Russia up to the standards of the West, he simply got rid of serfdom. The serfs weren't given land. If the serfs wanted to buy land, they had to then pay above the market value for it and become in debt to the government for years. The nobles weren't really compensated for their loss of the serfs. So in a lot of cases, the nobles were impoverished. The serfs were now landless. They were now totally poor peasants, and basically Russia got rid of serfdom, but they eliminated their whole economic basis. And the conditions worsened as time went by. A lot of these serfs ended up having to move to cities, ended up basically becoming like when you think of Victorian London, these slums, except they were far worse because there weren't any of the controls that there were in Western Europe at this time. And the situation for the poor people in Russia got worse. Now, Russia continued to advance, and one of the things that Russia built was the Trans-Siberian Railway. In 1904, they completed the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the main goal was this city of Vladivostok, which was a main Russian military base on the Pacific. Russia also had control at this point of a place called Port Arthur, which is today in China. And the railway came along, and today there are several different versions, but this first one, the red one, is the original that came along and through here. Originally, there even had to be a ferry across parts of Lake Baikal until they made a way around it. But this allowed the east and the west to be connected. So when the trains first started running, they could go a maximum speed of 40 kilometers an hour. So it took a full 3 weeks to get from Moscow to Vladivostok. And this, however, was obviously better than if you had to simply go on foot, which you're basically going back to pre-industrial times to try to make it across here. There was an all-Russia version that was completed in 1916, which allowed them to go all the way through without having to go through China. Now, in 1905, we had the Russo-Japanese War. Not an overly big war in terms of Western Europe, what you usually hear about, but as far as its effect on Russia, it was pretty massive. This again, similar map to what's in your book, showing the expansion of Russia from this to this. So Alexander II, the guy who freed the serfs, is the one who got this part over here and added it to Russia. He also added this part to Russia. And this brings Russia into conflict with Japan. So this was Russia's main naval base here in Vladivostok. Russia also had a lease on Port Arthur down here in China. Japan saw this as a threat. And they were not keen on Russia taking this because Japan at this point is wanting to establish their own control over the East. And they figured these Europeans have no business coming in and taking over this area. And so, since the center of Russia is over here, they figured this wouldn't be that difficult of a thing for us to do. So Japan declares war on Russia. And Russia has a few troops over here, but they don't have nearly as much as they need. And so they send their navy, starts out here in St. Petersburg, and you'll notice the dates. The small ships go through the Suez Canal. Some of them come here out of the Crimea and join in, but the big ships won't fit. So they go out, and they have to come around. It is November. They leave in October, November, December. In December, they stop here in Madagascar, and they wait for a few months. It is now 1905, March, April, May. It has taken them pretty much the better part of half a year to get around the globe to Japan. And Japan has no problem knowing that they're coming. Part of the reason that Russia sent these troops around, these ships, was to help this base here fend off the Japanese. Problem is, while the ships were waiting here, this port fell to Japan. So by the time the ships got here, the reason they came was pretty much gone. The only thing they could really do was make it to Vladivostok and try to reinforce the Russian ships that were there. Unfortunately, the admiral that was in charge of Vladivostok had basically taken his ships and hidden them inside the port so that they wouldn't get damaged. But of course, then they weren't able to do anything to the Japanese. They weren't able to help out in defending this Russian base here. And so Russia had a couple of options. They could have gone this way around and come in the safe way. They could have gone this way and avoided Japan altogether. Or they could have tried to sneak through here, going through what is the Japanese call the Sea of Japan. And the Japanese had a lot of boats around. They knew the Russians were coming. When Russia got here, Japan absolutely creamed them. Basically wiped out this entire fleet that had gone all the way around the world, come here, got wiped out in a couple days worth of battle. The few remaining ships went to Vladivostok, where they just simply hid again and were of no use to anyone. And Russia had to eventually ask for peace. And this was a major humiliation for Russia because Japan was an Asian country. This was the first time an Asian country had defeated a Western country in a major battle. And so Russia had to admit defeat. The Tsar had to make some changes at home, and they were very much not popular with the people. As time went by, the Tsar had to rearrange, had to try to make things better, had to make up for all this huge loss. He became incredibly unpopular, both with the nobles, both with the serfs. The nobility felt that he was taking advantage of them. The serfs, or I should say now the workers in the factories, rightly felt like they had been abandoned. Now along comes World War I. Hopefully you've heard of this before. It was started by the Archduke getting assassinated, and basically you had Russia, France, Britain versus Austria and Germany, and a few other hangers-on either side. And Russia was by far the weakest of the Allied powers. And at this point, the war goes on. I'm not going to go into the details of it. But in 1917, Russia is having troubles. A fellow by the name of Lenin has come to Russia. Actually, Germany sent him there. He was in exile in Switzerland. Germany sent him to Russia to try to cause problems. He was one of these people that today we call a communist. And yes, he raised all sorts of troubles, especially among these disenchanted workers. These people who had been taken advantage of, who didn't really have much future in Russia. So in 1917, the Tsar abdicates. And this is Tsar Nicholas II. He's under guard. He says, okay, I quit. And a provisional government came in, and they tried to rule Russia for about 9 months. It really didn't work out. There were groups on all different sides. There were those who said, we need to have a conservative government, something like a monarchy. There were those in the provisional government who said we need to have a Western democracy. But then there were also those, like Lenin, who said, nope, we need to have communism. So on November 7th, 1917, we had the October Revolution. Okay, so it's good to remember the date. The October Revolution happened in November because Russia at this point was still using the old calendar, which by that point was off 12 or 13 days. I'm not entirely sure at this point. But they were still on the old calendar. So while the rest of Europe, rest of the world, it was November, in Russia it was still October. And in the October Revolution, the communists basically take over the government. However, the other parts, those who support the Tsar, those who want a democratic government, don't give up easily. So from 1917 to 1920, you basically had a civil war between the Reds, which were led by the communist group called the Bolsheviks. Those were the communists who were the most radical, who felt that you needed to have basically a communist dictatorship to run the country, that you had to tell people what to do because they weren't ready to take over on themselves, versus the Whites, who was a mixture of people who were only unified in the fact they didn't like the Bolsheviks. You had monarchists, those who supported a Tsar, capitalists, those who wanted to be like the Whites, moderate socialists, those who said, yeah, socialism isn't bad, but let's have democratic socialism. We don't need a dictator. And one thing that isn't taught very often is that the remnants of the World War I allies, the Americans, the British, the French, basically went in and they were attacking from this direction. So the Allies, those who had thought, oh, the war is over, a lot of these soldiers ended up having to go fight in Russia for 3 years, for which they're very much not prepared. So here you can see these competing propaganda. This one is by the whites who are slaying that evil red dragon. And this is propaganda for the reds who are saying, now is your chance. You need to come and join us so we can defeat the evil whites and capitalists. So, needless to say, the Reds won. And 1920 to 1928, the Soviet Union, as it is now called, most of the Soviet Union was made up of Russia, but they had also taken over these other little countries around them. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, countries like that, and said, we are all now this union of these various countries, these republics. So Russia was the largest, the Russian Federal Socialist Republic, but you also had the Ukrainian Republic, the Moldovan Republic, the Belarusian Republic, or they call it the Belarusian. You had all of these little republics that joined into the Soviet Union. And Lenin basically ruled as a dictator, but he knew that you still had to have somewhat of a market economy, that Russia was not ready for pure communism. And so in order for Russia to have any sort of economic progress, you still had to basically be running things in a way that people could make money. And he was fairly successful in establishing the Soviet Union, of getting it started. 1928, he died. And you can still go and see Lenin today. So this is Lenin's body. I believe this year he turns 150 years old. And it's in this bit of a shrine. And you walk into this shrine, and you're not allowed to touch anything, and you have to walk along this little red carpet, and there's guards all over. At least there were when I visited back in the times when it was still the Soviet Union. And you go along and you walk along here, and you can't stop, so you just slowly walk, and you can look at his body, which is still there, it's still preserved. It is, scientists say it's maybe not entirely 100% biological, but the Soviet Union has a whole research institute that goal was to keep Lenin looking the same as he used to. And since the Soviet Union has collapsed, there's been calls to bury Lenin, and he's still there. So if you get a chance, you should go and take a look, peek at him before someone decides this is just too weird, and they go ahead and bury him. So Lenin was followed by Joseph Stalin, who probably ranks up there with Hitler in one of the most evil people to ever rule the world. And Stalin was in power from 1928 to 1953. He basically ruled the Soviet Union in a similar way that the Tsars did. It was his country. He had total control. He also didn't trust anyone. So a couple of times during his rule, he simply got rid of everyone who was close to him in power. Called these the Great Purges. He was also the ruler during World War II, at which point Russia lost millions and millions of soldiers compared to the hundreds of thousands that the Allies lost, soldiers and civilians. He was responsible for killing about 40 million of his own people through forced collectivization. If there were groups that he felt would not necessarily be loyal to him, as in the reading that you'll do, he'll talk about the Chechens, he simply moved them all, and if they died along the way, not a big deal. He imposed famines on part of the country by blocking food supplies so that the people there would starve to death. In general, he was ruthless, and he ruled until the very end. There's a recent movie came out, sort of a dark comedy, which I've only seen reviews of it, that's called The Death of Stalin. And when he died, the people who were still around, those next in power, had survived these purges, and they were honestly afraid that he was only faking his death. None of them wanted to do anything because they didn't want Stalin to wake up and say, "Ha, I was just kidding. So you and you and you off to get shot." So honestly, they waited for days before they were actually sure that he was really dead and not faking. And then there was a bit of a power struggle. And Nikita Khrushchev is the one who came to power after Stalin. And Khrushchev loosened up a bit. He basically denounced Stalin as this evil person. He said, we need to stop worshiping him because partially I want you to follow me now. And he realized that under Stalin's programs, the Soviet Union was not going to be able to make money. So he loosened up at home and he really pursued an expansionist foreign policy. He wanted to spread communism around the world. So his words were that eventually communism would bury the capitalist West, that there was no avoiding it. So he helped out in Cuba, he helped in other places like this. So a lot of the conflict of the Cold War, you can go back to this time of Khrushchev. He lasted until 1964, and he was followed by Leonid Brezhnev. So Brezhnev was also interested in this expanding in foreign policy. He wanted a little more friendly relations with the United States. He realized that Khrushchev came really, really close to nuclear war, and Brezhnev was a little less aggressive than Khrushchev in that way. But he also would support any government anywhere around the world that was enemies of the United States. Unfortunately, during Brezhnev's time, the Soviet Union's economy really began to stagnate. They were not making money. The industries were getting old. The people had very little incentive to work because of the communist system. And life just sort of dragged on. Brezhnev lasted until 1982. So Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States in 1980. Brezhnev was the first Soviet leader that he had to deal with. So after Brezhnev came a couple of old fellows that whose names aren't really all that important. Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. So Andropov was a former KGB agent. He was one of these old guys who had known Stalin, who was raised in the time in his political theory under Stalinism. And there was one point where he was absolutely convinced that the United States and Western Europe was about to attack. So he gave his commanders orders to attack the West with nuclear weapons. Fortunately, they didn't. He didn't last long. He died. And he was followed by the last of the old liners, the last of these people who had known Stalin, Konstantin Chernenko, who was very sick the entire time he was in power, just a matter of months. Most of that time, he was actually in the hospital, so he didn't do much. And he was followed then by the fellow who probably you could consider he's the one who ended the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev. Came into power, he was only 50-something. He looks older in the pictures, but he was actually fairly young. He had not been around during the time of Stalin. He was just a kid when Stalin was in power. So he comes with a whole new outlook. He realized the Soviet Union is collapsing economically. They cannot continue the way that things are going. We need changes. So he brings in a couple of reforms. He wanted more openness within the Soviet Union. He wanted a relaxation of their policies and a restructuring of their economy, and he wants to end the Cold War. He basically succeeds, but in the process, all of these countries that had made up the Soviet Union begin to declare independence. First of all, he loses the Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, and then he starts losing countries from within his own country, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and eventually, in December of 1991, Russia basically declares independence from the USSR. So this fellow here is the president of Russia. You remember, Russia was basically one of the states or provinces of the Soviet Union, and so it had a president. In addition, we have Belarus and Ukraine. So these were the three of these constituent republics. They signed a treaty saying we are now the Commonwealth of Independent States. So I guess this is the Ukrainians over here, these are the Belarusians. And they signed a treaty saying we will have our own group outside the Soviet Union. So what does this mean for the Soviet Union if Russia is no longer a part of it? It's kind of an oxymoron. And so on December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev announces that he is now stepping down as the leader of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is officially dissolved. So it happened to be Christmas Day in the West. Russian Christmas, because of their difference in calendars, didn't come until a bit later. This is just a normal working day, but it's an easy day to remember when the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Basically, Russia then took over the various parts of the government that had been run by the Soviet Union, and the other republics, as we've seen from our maps, became independent countries. So now as we look at post-Soviet Russia, what does this exactly mean? What was it like for the people? Okay, well, there's some pros. First of all, they had a lot more personal freedom. They could travel to West Germany if they wanted to. Well, by this point, they could travel to Germany. It was no longer split. They could travel to the US if they got the visas properly. They could start a business. They could do whatever they wanted. They weren't as watched by the secret police. However, there were an awful lot of cons, especially economically. It was no longer a controlled economy. There was a huge amount of inflation. You had an economic collapse. The government had run the businesses. The government had run the factories. Now the government isn't running them anymore. And so, because no one is there guiding it, the economy collapses. Under communism, or at least under Soviet socialism, everyone is guaranteed employment. Didn't matter if you were good at your job, didn't matter if you actually worked at your job, you at least were guaranteed a job, you were guaranteed money, and you weren't going to be unemployed. You also had the loss of social services. There's now no health care, no social security, no unemployment insurance, all these things that support this sort of the safety net that the people had grown used to under communism. So why did things get so bad? Well, if we look back to the days of Brezhnev, one of the things is that 25% of the money of the production in the Soviet Union was military. 25% of the country's budget went to the military. This means that 20 to 50% of the people worked for the military. Not that they were soldiers necessarily, but they built military equipment. They built tanks. They built rocket systems. They were scientists dealing with these type of ballistic missile systems. There were people who made tires for the army trucks. there was very little consumer goods that were being made. You didn't have a factory making toasters, you had a factory making machine guns. And in some parts of the country, 50% of the people worked for the military. Well, once Russia comes along, once the Soviet Union ends, they don't have the money to afford to keep spending so much on the military. They stop ordering tanks, they stop ordering trucks, which means the trucks don't need tires, which means the tanks don't need those fancy little rubber fittings that they make in the factory. The factories close. The people are out of work. Now, if you want to change a factory from making tanks to making toasters, you are going to lose time, you're going to lose money while you re-change your factory to make washing machines or cars or whatever it's going to be. And so there were losses as they changed these factories over. And these workers, all they had ever done was make tanks. They don't know how to make toasters. Another problem is the way that the Soviets' policy of distributing workers and resources, they would say that this area of the country is going to be focused on building this or making this. And you have to remember that the Soviet Union was made up of these many different republics. So for example, they said all of the cotton will be grown in the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. Well, now that is the country of Uzbekistan, and the only thing they've done there for the last 70 years is grow cotton. They don't have industry, so when they become independent, Russia doesn't have any more cotton. The people of Uzbekistan don't have any car factories. So 50% of the cities in the former Soviet Union had only one industry. If you look at Lurak has several industries. They have a chocolate factory, they have a fairly major textile factory, they've got a lot of things that will support the people. But 50% of the cities in the Soviet Union only had one industry. If that industry is making treads for a tank, that tank is no longer being built, everyone in that city is out of work. 75% of the cities had no more than 4 types of industry. So you can see that they don't have the broad spread of things where you could, in your area, you could get shoes and you could get toasters and you could get gas for your car. So production was reduced 50% across the board. There was, for example, if the iron is all made on the steppes of the Urals. In the Soviet Union, it was not a big deal if the factory that used that iron happened to be in Lithuania. They would put it on the train, it's one country, they would bring it to Lithuania. Not efficient, but it worked. Well, now that everything is broken up, sure, you've got this steel, but it's thousands of kilometers from the people who need it. Okay, social programs, healthcare, housing, retirement, education. We don't think of housing as a social program, but you've got to remember under communism, you didn't have private ownership, so the government provided a house for you. The companies were all state-owned. You worked for the government when you worked for this company. When they disbanded the Soviet Union and went to capitalism, these companies were now privatized. The companies couldn't afford to give the workers health care. They couldn't afford to give the workers housing. They couldn't afford retirement, education, all of these things which had been free before, you now had to pay for. But you are now unemployed. Your company didn't have the money, so even if you could pay for it, it wasn't there. Local governments couldn't cope. They couldn't take over this burden that had been borne previously by the government through these government-owned companies. And finally, the human capital, the people, the workers. So they were highly educated, but poorly motivated. Under communism, it didn't matter how well you did at your job, you got paid. Didn't matter how good you did, you wouldn't get promoted. If you did get promoted, you didn't necessarily get paid more. Everybody was guaranteed full employment, so it didn't matter if you worked hard or not. and the average worker was simply not prepared. People didn't know what it meant to have to compete. People didn't know what it meant to have to try to do a good job at your work. So here's a couple of numbers. Okay, this is a Russian gross domestic product. This is how much stuff they make. So Boris Yeltsin begins his reforms in earnest. 1990 is when things start falling apart. 1991, Soviet Union disappears. Okay, this is now Russia under Boris Yeltsin. The gross domestic product drops hugely. Okay, along comes till 1999, then things slowly begin to grow. Putin comes to power. Okay, it takes until 2007 when you get back to what it was like in the problems of communism. Okay, then Putin's lackey comes in, who, yeah, he really was, Putin was still in charge, had the economic depression of 2008, and then it basically, these numbers only go up through 2016. They're not much higher than they were under communism. So life hasn't improved. Life hasn't become as rosy as they would maybe see the first time they drive to Berlin in West Germany in 1989 and say, we could be like this. An even bigger problem is life expectancy. Hasn't declined that much for women, although it has. But notice Russian life expectancy, 1993 dropped to less than 58 years. Even today, the average life expectancy for a Russian male is less than 60 years. So this means that Russia is actually losing more people through death than it's gaining through births. A lot of this has to do with smoking, it has to do with unhealthy lifestyle, has to do with a lack of health care. So Russia is going to be facing a lot of troubles because people aren't moving to Russia, and whereas Western Europe is losing population because the birth rate is declining, Russia is losing population because people are suddenly dying off in mass, especially the men. So this brings us to Vladimir. So how did Putin get to power and why? The downturn in the 1990s was worse than the depression of the 1930s. We talk about the Great Depression, how terrible that was. It was bad for Russia. Stalin was overseeing this massive famine and such. 1990s was even worse. In the 1980s, you were communist. There were no goods. People could look at Western lifestyle and say, oh man, if we only had a Mercedes. But, at least you had money. You could buy your bread. You could buy your borscht. 1990s, it became capitalist. You now could buy an imported Mercedes from Germany, but nobody had the money. So it's one problem that you have no goods, but at least you have the money for your basic needs. Under capitalism, this supposed capitalism, you could get things if you were willing to pay a lot of money for it, but no one even had the money for the basic necessities. So here's an example from what it was like in the early 90s to go to a store. So you had to go into the store. Let's say you're going to like Penny Mart doing your daily shopping. You would go to the meat counter and you would tell the person what you wanted. And so the person would write the amount of what that is on a ticket. Then you had to go take the ticket to the cashier and pay for it. Each time you have to stand in line. Then you take the ticket that says you've paid for it back to the meat counter and get your meat. Then you have to go to the bread counter. You have to stand in line. You have to get a ticket at the bread counter. Then you have to take the ticket, go stand in line at the cashier, pay for it, go back and stand in line at the bread counter and get your bread. And even if you wanted shoes or a shirt, you had to go and tell the person what shirt you wanted. They would write on the ticket, etc., which was terribly inefficient. You ended up spending hours a day just in line. And maybe by the time you got to the front of the line, they would say, oh, sorry, we don't have that. We don't have a t-shirt, but we have some horse sausage. You know, life was really hard for people. 1988, 1.5% of Russians lived below the poverty line. 5 years later, 45% lived below the poverty line. So the average income fell from the equivalent of $72 a month, which doesn't sound like much, but things were cheap, to within 5 years, they were only making half that, and prices had gone way up. So in the 2000s, there's a slow recovery, as we saw, but it took a long time even to get back up to the level it had been under communism. And a lot of the people in Russia said, you know what? In the old days, I had a job. When we had a good, powerful leader, we were guaranteed that we would be able to put money on food on our table, that we would have money. And so it is part of the Russian mentality. If you look back through history, go to Ivan, go all the way back to Rurik, to all of these people who have come along, that the leader is a powerful person. The leader is the one who guides his people. And sometimes the leader does a terrible job of it and people die. But his responsibility is to be the one that's in charge of the country. They go to this capitalist thing. And basically, these semi-criminals, they call them the Russian mafia, those who had an in make a ridiculous amount of money. Everyone else falls on hard times. So a strong man like Putin comes along and says, you know what? We will go back to the way it was. We'll go back to having good control. And the people say, yeah, I like that. Democracy didn't really work for us, did it? You know, if Putin's going to help us, we'll vote for him. Besides, he looks so good on a horse without a shirt.